If you're new to drawing with ink pen, my first tip to you is to find a brand of pen and stick with it. If you wanted to learn to drive a car, you would probably have all your lessons in the same car, because that way you can become familiar with how a car works. And while a pen is obviously not quite as complicated as a car, the principle's a bit the same. Different pens operate in different ways. They have different ways of releasing the ink out of the pen onto the paper. They might have a ball, much like a ballpoint pen. They might have be more like just a nib where the ink just flows out of it. They might have more a felt tip where the ink flows through the textile nib onto the paper. And each of those things creates a different feel and a different flow effect. They have different types of inks which flow in different ways. The inks dry differently and with different speeds. There are water-based inks, there are alcohol-based inks. And depending also on the thickness of the pen, but also on the flow of ink, inks can take longer to dry. Different pens just feel different in the hand depending on how they're made. They can be different lengths if you put the cap on the end, if they're designed for that. All of these things affect the balance, affect the way the pen feels, affects the way we can actually hold it, because the amount of pen we have to move our fingers up and down and where we might like to hold it all change. My suggestion really is you choose a pen that you can purchase easily and it's well within your budget, so that you're not worried about using it up. When you do buy a pen, it's good to buy several thicknesses of the same pen. So this Copic Multiliner is the pen I tend to use in my large studio drawings that take 5 or 6 hours. I like to have 3 different thicknesses because I create different effects depending which one I use. However, all the pens feel the same, the nibs are all the same, they all operate the same way, and so the experience I gain in using one is pretty much completely the same with the other, just slightly different for the way the nib moves on the paper according to how thick it is. My second tip is to do with the paper. Now, the paper we use can certainly affect the drawing and our drawing experience with ink. Different papers have different thicknesses, different surfaces. Some are smoother, some are rougher, some are made in different ways. We have paper that's bound in books. We have some watercolor paper bound in a pad that's very expensive. Here's another pad. Here's larger paper bound in a pad. This is a heavier paper. There are lots of different papers. My suggestion is, when we're just starting, the best paper is the paper we can afford to waste. And that may be, if you like, scrap paper that has something on one side already that we can use without a care in the world, because it's cost us nothing. We can experiment with our lines, with what we're doing, and if it doesn't work out, we just chuck it out and don't give it a moment's thought. Or we can just use plain copy paper. We can buy a ream of 500 sheets and we can use that. And while it's fairly lightweight, it's a fairly good surface for ink, I think, because ink pens tend to do better with a smooth surface, and copy paper is nice and smooth. So it may not be so good for tone work because it's perhaps not thick enough and it will absorb too much of the ink rather than let it sit on the surface to be seen. But for just straight out ink pen work, it can be a really nice, very relatively cheap solution. So that's my advice. Use paper that you can afford to waste, if you like, that you can afford to make mistakes, because then you can experiment, then you can be bold with your drawing. My third tip, if you're just starting out with ink, is to spend a little time doing some practice lines. Now, generally, my advice is start drawing what you want to become good at drawing. So certainly don't do this instead of drawing the subjects that interest you. But I think it's worth spending a little time with ink, just practicing drawing lines and getting a feel for how that feels, particularly with whatever brand you've chosen, because it will be different according to the brand. Do lots of different lines. Get a feel for doing long lines, both horizontal long lines and vertical long lines. Practice drawing lines just using your wrist or your fingers, and then ones where you use your whole arm, even ones where you can use your whole body. You can practice doing straight lines and curves, and practice doing lines, keeping them parallel of all different lengths. Work out what lines you can draw easily and what lines require more effort. It's always good to know when we're drawing a subject what lines we need to slow down for, because they're the ones that we have most trouble with. And if you particularly want to draw architectural subjects, then certainly practice drawing long straight lines. And sometimes a way of doing that can be to actually draw a pencil line with a ruler and then practice going over that with your pen. Unless, of course, you're happy to draw lines with your pen with a ruler. It just depends what style you want to develop and what feel you want to have in your drawings. Another thing that can be helpful just in the practice exercise area is to practice drawing small rectangles of different sizes, different lengths, and particularly working at getting the sides parallel and then the tops at right angles and parallel to each other. Because in drawing architecture, these sort of shapes, they come up constantly, whether it's a capital, a column rather, goodness, whether it's a window, whether it's a chimney, and whether we're looking at something straight on or whether we're seeing it with some measure of perspective. There's a chimney seen from the side. We end up drawing these little box shapes an awful lot, and so it can be useful just to practice that skill of observation and coordination with our hand. It can be good to practice that just as an exercise. My fourth tip, if you're starting out with ink pen, keep drawing a line until you get it in the correct place. One of the things that can be very nerve-wracking about drawing directly with ink without any pencil guideline is that there's that pressure. If I get the line in the wrong place, I can't erase it. It's there. I want to make just a couple of points with this. The first is a mistake will never look as bad as when we've just made it. Okay? And secondly, we can correct it. You see, if I'm drawing a line and it wobbles a little bit, then if that line's one that matters, I'll draw the correct line over the top so that that line is in the right place. And if that looks a bit odd according to where it is, I'll quite possibly thicken the whole line. So now that just looks like a thicker line that's in the right place. Now, of course, that line wasn't particularly far out. So let's say I'm drawing a building in perspective. There, I just did it without meaning to. I wanted to do my example on this line, on this side. But let's say, so I get this perspective line nice and right. But in this line, I get this perspective line wrong. Now we can see that's wrong because, in fact, the perspective line has to be going the same direction as the line above it. It needs to be coming down. So do I just leave it when I realize I've got it wrong? No. What I do is I correct it. Now there are two ways I could correct it. I could just start at that corner and come down, making it right. What I would tend to do, if possible, is start a bit above and bring it a bit below. Okay, now I think that looks a lot less obvious at a glance than the mistake we had. And what I'd possibly do, just to disguise it a bit, is I might increase the thickness of the line at the bottom so that it blends in better. And then particularly if I'm adding a bit of depth here, then I can line those up with the correct line. And now that looks, you almost don't notice that mistaken line. So don't be afraid of putting the correct line in, because what I've just done is I've taught myself how to draw the correct line. And if I hadn't made that correction, then all I would have taught myself was drawing the wrong line in the wrong place the wrong way. And so now by adding that extra line, I've started to educate my eye and my hand and my thinking and my drawing to getting that line in the right place. Sometimes it could be a situation such as this. We might be wanting to draw a steeple on a tower. And we may draw it and then say, oh dear, that's leaning on one side. That's no good. So what can I can't do much about that. Well, you know, I would say you can. We could just make the tower slightly taller and then bring it down. And depending on the shape of the tower, and if for instance this tower is, this steeple, as they often are, is faceted, and if we're going to put colour on it for tone, then that can certainly help hide it. And so, you know, my point is that there are ways we can correct, and I think that looks less obvious with that correction than to have the tower leaning to one side. And again, what I've helped teach myself to do is how to actually get the tower in the right place. And hopefully next tower I draw, which may be in the same drawing, I've actually educated myself to have a better chance of getting the tip of that tower in the right place. So if we draw a line in the wrong place, correct it. The brain wants to see the correct line, and it will favour the correct line over the incorrect line. Here where I've got this wobble here, the brain will see this correct line before it sees the wobble line, if it notices the wobble line at all. And so, but if we don't put the correct line in, all the brain will see is the incorrect line, and I'll have no choice but to think, that doesn't look quite right. Okay, what's our last point? My fifth tip, if you're starting out drawing with line, is to think about line direction when you draw. Some line directions are easier than others. So it's important that we make choices with our paper, and we can move our paper so that our line direction becomes the easiest one rather than the more difficult one. For instance, if we're drawing a tower and again we want to put a spire on it, there are a few different ways we can do it. Generally, it's harder to push lines accurately than it is to pull them. And so I may want to actually start not at my tower, not at the top of my tower, but I may want to start at the tip of my spire and position that and then come down to the tower. Now I run the risk that I don't quite connect with the tower, but I've eliminated the risk that the tip of the tower will be in the wrong place. And so again, depending on my drawing and where the worst error to make is, I can actually improve my chances of a good outcome by how I draw my line direction. Similarly though, I can turn my paper upside down. And so now I'm actually pulling the lines towards me rather than pushing them away. Now that may work a lot more easily for me, a lot more accurately when I draw. So I need to consider that as well. But I think this area about line direction when we draw is perhaps most important when we think about curves, because depending whether we're left-handed or right-handed, we usually find curves in a certain direction easier to draw than others. And if I can just show what I mean, if we think of a circle as being, that's close enough. So in a circle, if we're right-handed as I am, usually that's the easiest part of the circle to draw accurately. And then possibly, even though I'm pulling it, I find that the easiest part. And I find these the most difficult parts, because it's really awkward with my hand, and with this one as well, I have to kind of move my hand more. This is probably the quadrant I have most trouble in. However, if we stop thinking of our paper as being stuck in place, I can draw the quadrants that come more easily for me. But look, if I rotate my paper, suddenly these two quadrants that were more difficult for me have just come into the happy positions. And now I can draw those lines much more easily, and I get quite a good outcome for a freehand circle that way. So being aware of the direction of our line, how comfortable our hand, our arm draws a line in that direction, and being aware that we can shift the orientation of the paper can really help us get a better line outcome. Since I've been videoing my drawings recently, I've had to learn to keep my paper locked in position and actually learn to move my body, move my arm, rather than move the paper. But this is a great thing to remember, particularly when we have curves to do. Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope some of those tips at least were helpful for you. If you're just starting a journey into drawing with ink, it's a wonderful medium to use. But if you've drawn for a long time with pencil, it can be a bit scary because it just seems so permanent and you can't erase any mistakes. And that takes a bit of getting used to. But as one who's further along in the ink drawing journey, let me tell you, it's also a wonderful medium to use. So persevere, don't be put off. Don't be afraid of mistakes, embrace them as part of the journey. The most important thing is whatever you're using, whatever you're drawing, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.